A missing woman walked out of Mount Hood National Forest after 21 days and told the search team that found her she had been living with Bigfoot. But what she described in the hours after she walked out, what she had seen, was something investigators were still trying to make sense of. A missing woman told the search team that found her that she's been living with Bigfoot in the Mount Hood National Forest. What researchers exposed about what Bigfoot had been doing to her is so insane, it's one of the biggest discoveries in 2026 so far. What the search team found at her Rachel Pemberton's campsite on September 15th stopped experienced trackers cold. Her tent was standing, her food cache was untouched, nothing was scattered, and there were no signs of panic, no struggle, no blood. But her boots had left their prints at the edge of the campsite, and then simply stopped. She had walked out willingly. Over the next 3 weeks, search teams logged hundreds of hours across Mount Hood National Forest. Helicopter crews ran grid patterns over the Cascades. Her face went up on missing persons boards from Portland to Bend. And somewhere in that same forest, during that same 3 weeks, the answer to every question those search teams were asking was sitting behind a waterfall that no ground team ever found, in a cave that did not appear on any map. Whatever woke her at 2 a.m. on September 12th was not a sound she had heard before in any forest. There were footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps that did not match any cadence she knew. Not a deer's rhythm, not a bear's rolling weight, not anything she could sort and dismiss in the way a person who has spent years in the backcountry automatically sorts and dismisses sounds in the night. These footsteps were bipedal. They were circling the campsite with a patience that suggested assessment rather than accident, and then they stopped. And then a hand pressed against the outside wall of her tent. The fingers were spread wide, each one longer than her entire hand. The pressure was even, steady, and light. There was nothing aggressive about the contact. That was the part that made it strange. Whatever was on the other side of that tent wall was not attacking. It was making contact deliberately, and it was waiting. She unzipped the tent. The creature standing in the clearing was approximately 7.5 feet tall, covered in dark reddish-brown hair that caught the pale moonlight across its shoulders and arms. Its hands were enormous. Its shoulders were wider than anything Rachel had stood next to in 2 decades of time spent outdoors. But what she described consistently to every person who interviewed her, across every account she gave, was not the size. It was the face, the intelligence in that face. This creature was looking at her the way a person looks at something they are trying to understand. It was not threatening her. It was studying her. And whatever it concluded in those first seconds would determine everything that happened next. Then it gestured. One massive hand lifted and beckoned, slow and deliberate. It wanted her to follow. And the question that would sit at the center of the next 21 days of Rachel Pemberton's life, the question she could not answer, the question that still had no clean answer when she walked out of that forest, was why? Why her? Why that night? Why follow her at all? Rachel grabbed her pack and her sleeping bag. She followed. Bigfoot moved through the forest with a silence that Rachel described as eerie and absolute. Something that large should have been audible at 100 yards. Instead, it moved between old-growth trees and over roots and through underbrush without a sound, pausing periodically to look back at her, adjusting its pace when she stumbled or fell behind. It was not oblivious to her, it was managing her, and there was no way to know yet whether that was protective or something else entirely. They walked for 2 hours. The terrain climbed. The creek she had camped beside gave way to steeper ground and denser timber, and the sound of water grew louder as they moved. The waterfall appeared suddenly, 30 feet of cascade down a basalt cliff face, the sound of it filling the whole corridor. The Bigfoot crossed logs that had been placed across a ravine above the pool, waited for Rachel to cross behind it, and then moved toward the cliff face. Behind the waterfall, invisible from any angle that did not involve crossing those logs, was the cave. The opening was 8 feet tall and 7 feet wide. Beyond it was complete darkness. Rachel had no way of knowing what was inside. She had no way of knowing whether she would be allowed to come back out. The Bigfoot entered first. She followed. What her eyes adjusted to as the darkness resolved into dim shapes was not a cave in the primitive sense she might have imagined. The chamber was roughly circular, perhaps 40 feet across, with a ceiling that vaulted to nearly 25 feet at its highest point. Light filtered down from two narrow fissures in the rock above. The floor was covered in layers of dried vegetation, ferns, moss, bark, arranged in a way that suggested deliberate preparation rather than accumulation. And in that chamber, 3 more Bigfoots were watching her from the shadows. The largest one was in the center. He was sitting when she entered, but even seated, his presence dominated the space completely. When he rose, Rachel estimated his height at about 8.5 feet. His hair was darker than the creature who had brought her, with gray working through it around his face and across his chest. His face carried horizontal scars across the chest and upper arms, marks from encounters serious enough to leave permanent evidence. His eyes were dark and completely still. When they moved to Rachel, she stood under a silence that had nothing to do with threat and everything to do with a judgment being made about her. Whatever that judgment was, she had no way to influence it. The female Bigfoot was slightly smaller, lighter in coloring, and moved with a quality Rachel kept describing as efficiency. Nothing wasted, every motion purposeful. She did not approach. She watched from a distance that felt calculated, monitoring Rachel and the 2 males simultaneously, her attention distributed in a way that suggested she was reading the social dynamics of the room at all times. The juvenile was perhaps 5 feet tall, wide-eyed, staying close to the far wall, making soft chirping sounds every few seconds that seemed less like communication and more like involuntary commentary on a situation it had no framework for. The patriarch made a single long vocalization directed at the creature who had brought Rachel in. The response was a series of quieter clicks and low sounds. The patriarch sat back down. The tension in the chamber shifted, not gone, but changed in quality. Rachel was not being asked to leave. Whether she would ever be allowed to was a different question, and one that nobody in that cave answered. She stayed for 21 days. The social structure Rachel observed in that cave was not what anyone would have expected. This was not a solitary animal. This was a functioning family unit with a hierarchy so clear that it governed everything, where each individual slept, who ate first, how decisions about movement and shelter were communicated and executed. And Rachel's place in that structure was never fully defined. She was not a prisoner in any conventional sense. But she was also not free. She was there because the patriarch had decided she could be, and she understood, without it ever being communicated directly, that the reverse decision was equally available to him. The patriarch led. When he decided the family should move deeper into the forest to forage, they moved. When he decided they should return to the cave, they returned. The authority was understood and built into every interaction, and yet it was not brutal. Rachel observed him watching the female's face after giving direction, registering her reaction as if her judgment mattered to him even when his word was final. There was a social contract operating here that Rachel had no access to the full terms of. She knew she was subject to it. She did not know all its conditions. The female Bigfoot was the family's educator, and Rachel watched this role performed with methodical consistency. On foraging trips along the creek about 1.5 miles from the cave, the female did not simply perform tasks and let the juvenile observe. She performed them once, slowly. Then she waited while the juvenile attempted to replicate what it had seen. When the juvenile made an error, selecting the wrong plant, gripping a root at the wrong angle, the female guided its hands through the correct motion. This happened again and again. She was not just providing food. She was transferring knowledge with the patience and precision of a teacher who had done this before and expected it to take time. That was not animal behavior. That was instruction. And watching it from the outside, Rachel could not stop thinking about what else this family knew that it had never had the opportunity to pass on to anyone outside itself. On the second day of Rachel's stay, the patriarch spent part of the morning reshaping a stick into a pointed digging implement. using a flat stone to scrape the tip against the basalt cave wall. The process took roughly 40 minutes. He tested the point multiple times before setting it with a collection of similar implements near the cave entrance, rocks and shaped sticks arranged by function. The female used large leaves as water containers and food wraps, and on the third day showed Rachel how to fold them correctly, demonstrating twice, waiting while Rachel attempted it, making a quiet sound of approval when Rachel got it right. The juvenile spent the next hour practicing the same fold with dead leaves on the cave floor, checking its results against Rachel's. The level of cognitive activity happening in that cave was staggering, and Rachel had no way to know whether being a witness to it was what was keeping her alive, or whether it was the thing that made her a problem. When helicopters approached the area on September 23rd, and again, the family's response made the stakes immediately clear. There was no panic, there was no confusion. The moment the sound of rotors became audible, long before Rachel could hear anything, the family moved with coordinated efficiency into the deepest section of the cave and went completely still. The September 28th pass was close enough that the sound was loud even inside the cave, and Rachel could see through the light fissures above that the aircraft was making a systematic sweep of the ridge directly overhead. The patriarch positioned himself at the cave entrance during this pass. His body blocked the opening entirely. His posture was alert and composed in a way that was not the posture of an animal that was frightened. It was the posture of something that had done this before, that had a plan for exactly this scenario, and that was executing the plan. The juvenile pressed against the female. Nobody made a sound. And Rachel understood, watching the patriarch hold that entrance, that the search teams above them had no idea she was there, and that whether they ever would was entirely outside her control. On the second day of her stay, the patriarch had shown her the secondary exit, a narrow passage in the rear of the chamber that opened onto the cliff face half a mile from the waterfall entrance. He walked her through it slowly, making sure she understood the route. She did not know at the time whether this was preparation for her eventual departure or preparation for a situation in which the family needed to move fast. The fact that it could be both was not reassuring. The vocalizations she spent 3 weeks studying operated across distinct registers. Close-range sounds were soft and frequent. Short clicks, brief hoots, tonal variations she gradually learned to separate into acknowledgments and questions. When one family member made a sound and paused, the expected response was another vocalization. When the response did not come, the original sound was repeated with a slight shift in tone. The communication system was real, it had structure, and she was on the outside of it entirely, with no way of knowing what was being decided about her. On the 6th day, the juvenile sat down beside Rachel while she was sketching a rough terrain map in the cave dirt, and picked up its own stick. It drew a circle, a line extending from the circle, a second circle at the end of the line. Then it tapped the second circle and looked at her. Rachel drew a similar pattern beside it. The juvenile's response was immediate, rapid, high-pitched vocalizations directed at the adults across the cave. The female moved closer and studied both drawings. She looked at Rachel. She made a low, single sound directed at the juvenile. Over the following days, the juvenile returned to this behavior repeatedly, drawing circles and lines and geometric patterns and watching Rachel's responses, testing whether the symbols meant the same thing to both of them. Rachel could not fully determine what the symbols meant. What she could determine was that the juvenile was not copying her. It was initiating, offering symbols, and waiting to see if she would recognize them. That was not mimicry. That was an attempt at communication. And whatever the juvenile was trying to tell her, the answer to whether she would ever fully understand it was tied directly to the question of whether she would still be in that cave long enough for the communication to develop further. On day 12, Rachel slipped on wet rocks during a foraging trip about 1.25 miles from the cave and turned her ankle badly enough that she could not put full weight on it. The family was between her and the cave, and the question of how she would cover that distance was immediately apparent to everyone present. The female assessed the injury with clinical precision, examining the ankle with careful hands, making a decision, then left the group and returned with wild ginger and devil's club, both plants with documented anti-inflammatory properties. She demonstrated how to make a poultice and guided Rachel's hands through the process. The swelling reduced enough for Rachel to walk with help from the juvenile, who stayed beside her the entire return distance and matched her reduced pace without a sound. The care was real. That was what made it complicated. These were not animals managing a captive, but they were also not neutral parties. The patriarch had brought her here for reasons Rachel could not fully articulate even after 3 weeks of proximity, and the question of what happened when those reasons were satisfied, or when they weren't, was one she could not stop circling. The family relocated 3 times during those 21 days, brief moves to a secondary shelter following heavy helicopter activity, returning to the cave each time after the threat passed. The relocations were executed without chaos. The contingency was well practiced. Whatever system this family had developed for surviving in a landscape that was increasingly full of human activity, it had been refined over time by people who had no margin for error. On October 3rd, 19 days after search teams had logged Rachel Pemberton as a priority missing person, the patriarch began vocalizing in a register she had not heard before. Longer, more deliberate, a tonal quality she described as finalized. The female responded. The juvenile made a sound she identified after 3 weeks of listening as something between a question and a protest. The patriarch repeated the same vocalization, and the juvenile went quiet. Below the cave, on the other side of the waterfall and the log bridge and the ridge that separated the cave from the search grid, a ground team was getting close. Rachel could not hear them yet. She could see it in the patriarch's posture at the entrance. Something had changed in the forest outside, and the family had already responded to it. The patriarch stepped away from the entrance and gestured toward it with one large hand. The same deliberate, unambiguous gesture that had started all of this 3 weeks earlier. He was telling her to go, and she still did not fully know why she had been taken, or what the decision to release her was based on, or whether she had spent 21 days as a guest or as something the family had not yet found a word for. The juvenile crossed the cave and rested its fingers against the back of her hand for a moment. Light, specific contact that was nothing like the incidental contact of 3 shared weeks. Then it moved away. The female made a sound, a single quiet vocalization that was the closest thing to a farewell Rachel had ever heard from something that did not use human language. Rachel picked up her pack and her sleeping bag. She walked to the entrance and crossed the log bridge for the last time. The waterfall sound filled the air behind her. The cave entrance disappeared into the cliff face as though it had never been there. She walked downhill through the forest until she heard voices on the ridge below. She walked toward them. Deputy Mark Collins and his team were approximately 40 yards from the ridgeline when a woman in hiking clothes appeared from the tree line, moving carefully down the slope with a slight limp. She was not in distress, not disoriented, not showing any of the physiological signs that normally mark the end of a 21-day missing persons case. She was tired and slightly malnourished, and her ankle was wrapped with plant material, but she was cognitively sharp and physically intact in a way that contradicted nearly everything a 3-week disappearance usually produced. The medical evaluation conducted in Hood River that afternoon confirmed she was healthy. No signs of hypothermia, no infection, no psychological trauma in the clinical sense. She was dehydrated. She had lost weight, but she was functional, and she was not displaying the symptoms of someone who had been through a traumatic event. What she was displaying was knowledge she had not possessed before September 12th. Investigators noticed it almost immediately. When shown photographs of alleged Bigfoot footprints, Rachel identified specific anatomical details: weight distribution patterns, arch flex points, toe splay degrees, with a precision that could not be explained by prior knowledge. She had no background in primate anatomy. The knowledge she demonstrated was the kind that came from direct, extended observation. She identified Pacific Northwest understory plants with medicinal anti-inflammatory properties and described their preparation with accuracy that aligned with ethnobotanical records. Her prior education gave her no framework for any of it. Her account was consistent across every interview, every follow-up, every attempt to find discrepancies. The patriarch with his scars and his gray-touched hair, the female with her lighter coloring and methodical intelligence. the juvenile with its geometric drawings in the cave dirt, the secondary shelter, the log bridge, the ankle injury, and the poultice, the helicopter passes, and the family's practiced, silent response. None of it changed. None of it contradicted itself. Rachel refused, throughout all of these conversations, to identify the cave's location. She said the family was still there. She said the location was their only protection. She said she would not be the reason that changed. Her public statement, released on October 5th, was short. The creatures were real. They were more intelligent than most people had imagined. They had language, tools, family structures, and emotional bonds. They were aware of human civilization and actively hiding from it, and they deserved to be left alone. Rachel returned to Portland and largely withdrew from public life, resuming work in environmental education with a focus on wilderness ethics. The idea that the Pacific Northwest forests were not fully known and that the appropriate response to that fact was restraint rather than investigation.